Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're tackling a subject that's, well, pretty fascinating and definitely complex. The Catholic Church's relationship with the Jewish people.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is, and to guide us through it, we're using this book by E. Michael Jones called The Catholic Church and the Jews.
I've heard of that one.
Have you? It's already sparking a lot of thoughts, that's for
I
sure.
bet. Lots to unpack there.
Exactly. And luckily, we have an expert here with us.
Happy to help untangle some of those historical and theological threads. Always a pleasure to be here.
So one of the first things that jumped out at me in the book was this kind of inherent contradiction, right? The church's mission is to convert Jews to Christianity, but at the same time, they're trying to protect them from persecution. Like, how does that even work?
It's a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what makes this whole relationship so interesting. The book really digs into how this played out, especially through major historical moments and figures.
So are you saying it's like a pendulum swinging back and forth between converting and protecting?
Yeah, you could say that. The church is always trying to find that balance.
Okay, that's a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah.
Now, Jones also brings up this concept of logos and contrasts it with what he calls the Talmudic understanding. Can you explain that a bit? I have to admit, theology isn't exactly my strong suit.
Sure. Logos is, well, it's kind of hard to sum up quickly, but Pope Benedict XVI described it as this idea of a rational order in the universe that comes from God. It's very rooted in Greek philosophy, where reason and order reflect the divine.
Okay, I think I'm following so far, but what about this Talmudic understanding? What's the Talmud?
Oh, right, good point. The Talmud is basically a collection of Jewish teachings and commentaries on law and tradition. It developed after the Second Temple was destroyed and became really important in shaping Jewish thought.
Okay, so Jones is saying that the Talmud represents a different set of values than the logos concept.
Exactly. And he thinks that creates this fundamental divide between Christianity and Judaism.
So we're talking about a clash of worldviews, right? How each faith sees the universe and humanity's place in it.
Right. And he uses these historical examples to illustrate his point.
Right.
Like he talks about how the early church condemned the Talmud.
Condemned it. Why?
They claimed it was promoting behavior that was harmful to non-Jews.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly a friendly start to the relationship.
Not exactly. Then he jumps ahead to the Crusades and focuses on Bernard of Clairvaux.
The Crusades. That was a pretty messy period, to say the least.
For sure. But Bernard's an interesting figure. He condemned violence against Jews.
That seems like the right stance to take.
It does, but at the same time, he also believed that they were, spiritually blind because they rejected Christ.
Yeah.
So kind of a mixed bag.
It's like trying to protect them physically, but also condemning them spiritually. What a weird position to be in.
Right. It just goes to show how complicated this relationship really was.
Yeah, definitely not a simple good guys and bad guys situation. Now, I know Jones's book gets into some, let's just say, controversial territory.
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of that.
Like, when he talks about Jewish involvement in various revolutions, he even brings up the Bolshevik Revolution and quotes people like Winston Churchill and Woodrow Wilson. I have to admit, that's where I started to feel a little uneasy. It seems like we're getting into some potentially dangerous waters here.
I get that. It's important to remember that just because some people from a certain group were involved in something doesn't mean the whole group was behind it. We have to look at the bigger picture and not jump to conclusions.
Right, and we definitely don't want to endorse any particular viewpoint here. It's more about understanding the argument that Jones is making.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Even if it makes us a little uncomfortable, that's part of the point of doing a deep dive like this, right? To engage with these ideas.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's about filling in the gaps in our knowledge. He brought up this guy, Lazar Kaganovich, and his role in the Gulag system. I had never even heard of him before.
See, that's what's so great about these deep dives. We learn new things and get a deeper understanding of history.
Okay, so we've got this clash of worldviews playing out in these historical flashpoints. Then Jones shifts gears and talks about the Black-Jewish alliance during the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, that was a period known for progress, right? But he paints a different picture.
Oh, yeah, he definitely brings up some different perspectives on that.
He suggests that Jewish financial and strategic influence in organizations like the NAACP might have led to certain groups like Southern conservatives and Northern Catholic ethnics being targeted. He uses Benjamin Ginsberg's book, The Fatal Embrace, as support for this idea.
That's a pretty bold claim. It's definitely something to consider carefully.
Right. And it reminds us that even movements with good intentions can have unintended consequences.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface and acknowledging that history is rarely simple.
It's like peeling back the layers and recognizing that even in a movement fighting for justice, there can be conflicting agendas. It's fascinating, really.
It is, and it makes you think about how we interpret history and whose voices get heard.
Okay, so this brings us to a major turning point in the church's relationship with the Jewish people. The Second Vatican Council and the document Nostra Aetate.
Ah, yes, Nostra Aetate. Pivotal moment for sure.
The book takes us behind the scenes and talks about how it was drafted and passed. He says that Jewish groups lobbied for a statement condemning anti-Semitism, but then he gets into this whole thing about how anti-Semitism wasn't even clearly defined in the document.
That's an interesting point. By not defining it, they kind of left it open to interpretation, which could lead to problems down the road.
Exactly. And Jones argues that this ambiguity has been used by some to further criticize the church and accuse it of historical anti-Semitism. He brings up examples like Daniel Goldhagen's accusations against Pope Pius XII. And he even mentions plays like The Deputy, which portrayed Pope Pius XII as indifferent to the Holocaust.
So he's suggesting that Nostra Aetate, while intended to improve relations, may have inadvertently opened up new avenues for criticism.
Exactly. And this leads us into some even more contentious topics. Jones dives into the sexual revolution and says that Jewish individuals played a significant role in breaking the Hollywood production code, which he believes led to a decline in morality.
That's a hot-button issue for sure. It's important to be careful when talking about these things.
Oh, absolutely. We're not saying that he's right or wrong here. It's more about understanding the argument he's making and how it fits into his larger thesis.
Right. It's about analyzing his perspective and engaging with it critically.
Okay, so we've got this theological clash playing out, these historical flashpoints, and then these arguments about the role of Jewish individuals in various social and political movements. It's a lot to process.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
You're telling me we haven't even gotten to his analysis of the abortion movement, gay marriage, or his concept of the Jewish revolutionary spirit.
Lots more to unpack, but that's for next time.
Right, we'll save that for part 2.
So picking up where we left off, let's talk more about this Jewish revolutionary spirit and how Jones sees it at work in specific movements. One that really stood out was his take on the sexual revolution.
Yeah, that was a big one. He argues that Jewish individuals were key players in breaking the Hollywood production code.
Right. And he thinks that led to a more permissive culture and, a decline in morality, at least from his perspective.
And he actually uses this article by Professor Nathan Abrams in the Jewish Quarterly to back up his argument, which I thought was really interesting.
Why is that?
Well, because Jones has been labeled anti-Semitic for making these claims, but Abrams, who's Jewish, basically confirmed Jones's observations, and no one accused him of being anti-Semitic.
I see what you mean. So Jones is basically saying, if a Jewish scholar can acknowledge this, why am I being called anti-Semitic for simply talking about it?
Exactly. Like there's a double standard going on.
Right. Jones is suggesting that there are these unspoken rules about what you can and can't say about Jewish involvement in certain things.
Like certain topics are just off limits if you don't want to be labeled a bigot.
And what's interesting is that Abrams, in his article, doesn't seem ashamed of this history at all. He actually asks, what are we ashamed of? Like he's almost proud of it.
That's wild. It's like he's saying that breaking sexual taboos and challenging traditional morality is a good thing, which, if you think about it, really fits in with Jones's idea of the Jewish revolutionary spirit.
It does, doesn't it? It challenges us to think about whose perspective we're hearing from and how history can be interpreted in different ways.
Like, are we celebrating progress or are we celebrating the dismantling of a certain set of values? It makes you wonder.
Big questions, for sure. Now, Jones also connects this whole breaking the production code thing to his analysis of the abortion movement.
Yeah, he sees a similar pattern there. He says the push for legal abortion was also driven by Jewish activism and that it targeted Catholic opposition.
Specifically, he highlights figures like Lawrence Larder and talks about how they used anti-Catholic sentiment to push for abortion rights.
He's saying it wasn't just about women's rights, but also about weakening the Catholic Church's power.
Right, like it was a deliberate attack on their moral authority.
And he keeps pointing to this tactic of dividing and conquering.
Like with narrow splitting Catholics into liberal and conservative camps to weaken opposition to abortion. And Jones thinks the media basically ignored this anti-Catholic stuff because they were sympathetic to the abortion rights movement.
So it's not just about supporting abortion, it's about specifically targeting the Catholic Church.
That's how Jones sees it. And he sees a similar pattern in the push for gay marriage, too.
Oh, yeah. He brings up Vice President Biden praising Jewish influence in changing attitudes toward gay marriage and the involvement of groups like Bend the Arc.
He even mentions the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism.
It's like he's saying there's this deliberate push to change American morality, especially when it comes to sex and family.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he ties it all back to this Jewish revolutionary spirit that he keeps talking about.
Okay, but wouldn't some people say that these movements, like gay marriage and abortion rights, have actually been good things? That they've made society more equal and given people more freedom?
Of course. There are definitely different perspectives on all of this. It's important to remember that the book presents a very specific viewpoint.
Right. We're not saying Jones has all the answers. It's about understanding his argument and then thinking critically about it.
Exactly. It's about engaging with these complex issues, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Okay, so let's circle back to this synagogue of Satan concept. I'm still not quite sure I understand what he's getting at.
Well, he's basically saying that it represents a complete rejection of logos, that rational order coming from God that we talked about earlier.
So it's not just about rejecting Christ, it's about rejecting a whole way of seeing the world.
Right. And he believes that this rejection is what drives all this Jewish revolutionary activity that he sees throughout history.
And he claims that this synagogue of Satan has been around in different forms for centuries. He mentions everything from the Sanhedrin to the Politburo to modern-day groups like the ADL and AIPAC. That seems like a pretty big claim.
It is. And it's definitely one of the most controversial parts of his book. We have to be careful about making generalizations, you know.
Of course. But it's also important to understand why he's making these arguments, even if we don't agree with them. Like when he talks about the ADL being part of this synagogue of Satan, what evidence does he give?
Well, he points to times when the ADL has condemned people or groups who are critical of Israel or Jewish influence. He sees that as trying to silence dissent and control the narrative.
So it's about controlling how people think about these sensitive topics.
Exactly. It's a battle for hearts and minds, basically.
Now, there's one more thing I wanted to ask about. Jones talks about these proud, self-hating Jews. What's that all about?
He's basically saying that not all Jewish people agree with what he sees as the dominant ideology within Judaism. He points to figures like Gilad Atzmon, who was born Jewish but became a big critic of Zionism and what he calls Jewishness.
So these are people who are rejecting their own heritage, at least as Jones defines it.
Right. And Jones says that these people are often ostracized or labeled as self-hating just for speaking out. He sees it as a sign of intolerance.
So it's like even within the Jewish community, there are people who are pushing back against this revolutionary spirit that Jones is talking about.
Exactly. He's trying to show that this isn't an attack on all Jewish people, just on a certain ideology that he believes is harmful.
It's a tricky argument for sure. How do you talk about these things without sounding like you're stereotyping a whole group of people?
It's a tough balance, and it's one of the reasons why this book is so controversial. It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable questions about identity, history, and religion.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about the sexual revolution, the abortion movement, the synagogue of Satan, and even these proud, self-hating Jews. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And we're not done yet.
Right. In the last part, we'll talk about Jones's analysis of modern Jewish identity and his call for the conversion of Jews to Christianity.
That's sure to be interesting.
To say the least.
All right, so we're diving into the last part of our deep dive into E. Michael Jones's The Catholic Church and the Jews. And, well, things are going to get even more controversial.
That's putting it mildly. His whole thing about converting Jews to Christianity, that's pretty out there, wouldn't you say? Especially these days.
It definitely goes against the grain, especially with all the emphasis on interfaith dialogue and religious tolerance nowadays.
Yeah, like, shouldn't we be focusing on finding common ground instead of trying to change each other's beliefs?
That's a common view today. But it's important to understand why Jones thinks this is so important. It's actually central to his whole argument.
Okay, so why does he think the church should be focused on converting Jews?
Well, he believes it's the church's fundamental duty to evangelize, to spread the gospel and bring salvation to everyone. And in his view, that includes the Jewish people too.
He even says that the church has kind of abandoned this mission by focusing too much on dialogue and interfaith relations. Like they're too worried about being polite and not offending anyone.
Yeah, that's his critique. He thinks all this emphasis on dialogue, especially after Nostra Aetate, has made the church downplay the differences between Christianity and Judaism. Like they're shying away from saying that conversion is the goal.
So it's not enough to just respect other faiths. You have to actively try to convert them. That seems kind of aggressive, don't you think?
It definitely can come across that way, but from Jones's perspective, conversion's the only way to achieve true reconciliation. He believes that bringing Jews into the Christian faith is the only path to salvation.
But wouldn't a lot of people, especially Jewish people, see that as super disrespectful, like a form of spiritual imperialism?
That's a valid point. But Jones argues that the church can't compromise its beliefs just to avoid offending people. He thinks the truth of the gospel is more important than being politically correct.
So he's basically saying that theological truth trumps interfaith harmony. You can't have both.
Yeah, that's his view. He thinks the church can't go along with the whole all religions are equal idea that's so popular today.
It's like he's advocating for a return to a more old school way of evangelizing, where you're not afraid to step on some toes.
That's one way to put it. He's not afraid of a little spiritual confrontation.
Now, this whole conversion thing,
Mm.
how does that square with the church condemning anti-Semitism? Those two things seem kind of contradictory.
It is a bit of a tightrope walk, but Jones makes a distinction between hating Jews as people and challenging what he sees as the theological errors of Judaism.
So you can disagree with someone's beliefs without hating them personally.
Exactly. He thinks the church can condemn anti-Semitism while still believing that Jews need to be converted.
Okay, but wouldn't a lot of Jewish people find that offensive? Like, we love you, but you're wrong and need to change your beliefs.
Probably. But Jones would say that true love involves telling people the truth, even if it's hard to hear. And for him, the truth is that salvation only comes through Christ, and the church has a duty to offer that to everyone, including Jews.
So it's not just about converting individuals, it's about this bigger battle between good and evil.
Right. He sees the Jewish revolutionary spirit as a direct threat to God's plan for the world, and he thinks the church has to fight back.
It's a pretty dramatic way of looking at things.
It is. But whether you agree with him or not, he's raising some important questions about religion, history, and how we interact with people who have different beliefs.
Well, this whole deep dive has been a wild ride. We've covered so much ground: historical clashes, theological debates, controversial theories about revolutions and social movements. It's been intense.
Definitely not your average light conversation.
And we've explored Jones's arguments about the Jewish revolutionary spirit, his critique of modern Jewish identity, and even his call for the conversion of Jews to Christianity.
We've delved into some really sensitive topics. It's been a challenge to unpack all of this.
It has. But we made it. And hopefully our listeners have learned something along the way. Even if they don't agree with everything Jones says, we hope this has challenged them to think critically and consider different perspectives.
That's what these deep dives are all about, right?
Mm.
Getting people to think outside the box and engage with complex issues.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this episode, maybe we can leave our listeners with something to ponder. Does the world we live in today, with all its political and social upheaval, give any weight to the idea of this Jewish revolutionary spirit? Or is that just a dangerous and divisive concept? It's a tough question, but one worth thinking about. And on that note, we'll say goodbye for now. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.